Welcome back. Later today, the Secretary General of NATO will visit Congress and meet with Secretary of State Antony Blinken while in Washington. It comes after President Biden hosted him at the White House yesterday. A readout of the meeting said the two discussed NATO's defense spending, including a record 23 allies set to reach the 2% defense spending threshold. Next month, Washington will host the NATO summit, the first to be held since Sweden became a member. Meanwhile, thousands of Israelis are calling for new elections and the immediate return of the hostages being held in Gaza. A protest was held outside of Israel's parliament in Jerusalem yesterday. It started shortly after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced he's dissolving his war cabinet. Netanyahu made the decision following the resignation of two moderate members who claim the prime minister has not formed a strategy for the war or its aftermath, and that sentiment apparently shared by many Israelis. Yesterday, a group of activists outside Netanyahu's home chanted, "You are the chief, you are to blame." That demonstration led to some clashes with police, as you can see here. Water cannons were fired in an effort to disperse the crowd, and at least 9 people were arrested. Joining us now, former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, retired 4-star Navy Admiral James Stavridis. He is Chief International Analyst for NBC News. Admiral, good morning. So good to see you this morning. Let's start with Israel and your reaction to Netanyahu's decision to disband the war cabinet. What do you think it means for the war going forward?
He had no choice. The cabinet had two centrists on it, General Benny Gantz and General Gadi Eisenkot. And those two were kind of anchoring the middle of the line, if you will. When they bailed out, as I think any rational centrist would do, given the Netanyahu policies, Netanyahu faced the choice of either bring in some additional right-wing people or dissolve the whole thing. He did the latter. In terms of what it'll do going forward, it won't change much, unfortunately, Jonathan, because those two centrists and former leaders of the Israeli Defense Forces were, I think, the voices calling for more humanitarian aid. Therefore, they're gone. This is just going to allow the right-wing hardliners, if you will, to continue military operations.
So NATO, of course, a subject near and dear to your heart. We mentioned that Secretary General Stoltenberg is in Washington now. It's ahead of the NATO summit next month, the 75th anniversary of that organization, and this summit being held in Washington. And, of course, the war in Ukraine will be a central focus. So let's start with simply your assessment of the strength of NATO right now.
Never been stronger, full stop. You mentioned in your read the addition of not only Sweden, but Finland. These are two turnkey militaries. They deployed with us to Afghanistan. They bring tremendous capability. And as you're showing, the geography is very difficult for Putin, gives him an additional 600 miles of border. Finally, the Secretary General, and this really put a smile on the face of the former Supreme Allied Commander, announcing 23 of the nations are now hitting the 2% goal. Hey, when I was Supreme Allied Commander, that number was 9. So that's a major testament to the strength of the alliance. And of course, all of it is the result of the greatest salesman for NATO in history, Vladimir Putin. He has finally gotten the Europeans to wake up and spend on their defense.
We should note that Secretary General Stoltenberg will be a guest on Morning Joe a little later on. So the summit comes as the war in Ukraine continues. Russia has floated some sort of peace proposal that Ukraine seems likely to reject out of hand. Give us your assessment, Admiral.
Total non-starter. It not only calls for Ukraine to formally hand over Crimea and 4 of its major provinces, effectively legalizing a land grab of 20% of their nation. It also absolves Vladimir Putin of any sanctions going forward, no war crimes tribunals, and Ukraine would be defenestrated, their military effectively stripped away from them, forced neutrality. It would put Ukraine as a sitting duck for Putin to come back for another bite at the apple. It's a non-starter.
So therefore, the war seems to continue even in a sort of a stalemate. We saw the U.S. and its allies meet the G7, trying to send more funding to Ukraine, even Trump-proof it to make sure it could continue no matter what happens in November's election, as this war seems likely to drag on for quite some time. We appreciate the analysis, as always, from retired